Memory is a funny thing. I remember taking family trips to visit my grandmother in Cincinnati every year. My brother and I would share the attic room where our dad grew up. We spent our days playing in the yard, exploring the streets, and just sitting in this magical attic. I remember the volumes of classic novels bound together that we would read sitting on the floor under the posters of bands and events that were the height of cool in the late 60s. My dad was the coolest until 1973. I recently talked with my brother about his memories of those visits. He remembered the yard and the attic and the cool posters. But he had no memory of the classic novels and curling up on the attic floor. What he most vividly remembered was searching the basement for my dad's model train set, a mythical toy that never actually turned up. I didn't even remember that Grandma had a basement, let alone a lost model train. How was it that we both remembered these trips so differently? Well, as it turns out, the act of remembering changes our memories. Simply revisiting these moments changes them in our minds. When it came to our visits to Grandma, my remembering spotlit the novels, and my brother's remembering spotlit the train. I became an historian, he became an engineer. We were there together, experiencing the exact same thing, but time and two different brains turned this into two different stories entirely. Neuroscience tells us that it may be impossible for humans or any other animal to bring a memory to mind without altering it in some way. It turns out that the more frequently we recall a memory, the more it can change. And our memories of accidents or deaths, or even of national or international tragedies like 9/11, memories with deep emotional charge, they are particularly susceptible to change each time we recall them. What research shows is that our brain's neurons and synapses make connections and build bridges, but don't necessarily preserve complete or true memories. Our emotions color our memories, even change our memories, perhaps in service of keeping us from repeating the mistakes of our past. What our brains do is recast old memories in light of everything that has happened since. Oh, Zeki. You won't be surprised to learn that our tradition is no different from what neuroscience teaches us. Our tradition also recasts the past in light of everything that happened after. Our parashah this week, Ki Tavo, has Moses giving us instructions for the offering of our first fruits, our bikurim. We are told to begin this agricultural ritual by affirming, Arami Oved Avi, my father was a wandering Aramean. Ancient rabbinic commentators and modern biblical scholars tell us that the wandering Aramean was Jacob, Israel, the father of all 12 tribes and therefore father of all Jews, whether we were born to Jewish parents or not. Jacob is remembered by Moses as a wandering Aramean, but was he really? Jacob's own story in Genesis is that of a privileged and possibly greedy boy who flees directly from his childhood home to his uncle's home in Aram. He doesn't wander, and he is not himself an Aramean. But over the generations between Jacob and Moses, Jacob's story was told and retold until he became a wandering Aramean. The memories of his story were retold and revisited and revised until Jacob became something that he was not. But this change makes sense, actually, in light of everything that happened after Jacob's life. His descendants did wander the wilderness for 40 years, and we did become a people of permanent wandering with the destructions of our temple. as the father of Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, the children of Jacob. Turning Jacob into a wanderer also helps us find a common source for our shared story as Jews, whether or not Jacob was actually a wanderer in his life. Moses also retold and revisited and revised over and over. In fact, the entirety of Deuteronomy is a Mosaic retelling, a revisiting of memory, a revision of history. Our story as a people changes in Deuteronomy through Moses' act of remembering. But at some point, Moses' story wasn't just remembered, it was recorded. It became Torah. Whatever he had received from prior generations, it's the story that's written down that stays put, that's fixed, that's preserved. That's what gets handed down. In our sacred texts, as in our lives, the memories that we make and revisit are our Torah. Writing these stories down in memoirs or ethical wills or even in emails preserves them for the future and protects them from our revisionist brains. The earliest history of Central Synagogue, known then as Ahavat Chesed, was written down. It was preserved so it couldn't be lost and couldn't be forgotten. The founders of our congregation kept detailed notes of every birth, marriage, and death in the community. But the earliest records of our community, the earliest records of our life cycles, were lost. This book of lives was removed, taken from our building as if it had never existed, as if the people whose memories and names were preserved in its pages had never existed. And then, unlike my dad's model train set, the Book of Lives appeared. This spring, we learned that it had made its way into the hands of a dealer and was being sold at auction abroad. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think is an epic story of international intrigue. The historic volume thought lost to history appears. Alerts come in from across the world, pinging into my inbox in quick succession. And what follows is an exciting series of late-night calls and early morning news flashes. No sleep. Lawyers and collectors and curators and rabbis on 3 continents trying frantically to negotiate the return of this book. Finally, after 2 months of negotiations, an unassuming FedEx box arrived at Central a couple of weeks ago. Opening it, I felt like I would find inside a treasure, a glowing golden relic. It was a very Indiana Jones moment. Now, I think this story has the makings of a blockbuster movie, and I obviously want Rachel Weisz to play me, because who wouldn't? In reality, inside the FedEx box was a brown, leather-bound book, its binding starting to disintegrate, its pages worn and colored with age. It was absolutely gorgeous because it was our book of lives. We now know that our member, Meyer Münster, died at age 58 on August 7th, 1849, the first death in this new community. We also now can remember that the first simcha, the first joyful event in our community, was a double wedding of Simon Asher and Maria Skal, and Moritz Prascheisner and Carolina Wolf on November 11th, 1849. All of this was recorded in German, teaching us that our earliest members were immigrants who retained the language of their birth, the language of the old country. But the wedding of Louis Josephy and Blanche Isabel Flesch on October 11th, 1899, was the first time that a life event was recorded in English, telling us something about the process of the Americanization of our congregation. Each of these memories matter And recorded in this book, they are no longer subject to the whims of our brains. With our book of lives returned to us, Meyer and Simon and Maria and Moritz and Carolina, Louis and Blanche, they and all the others are no longer forgotten. They have been restored to us. When asked to recall where you were when you learned about the earliest records of Central Synagogue, your imperfect neurons and synapses may cause you to point to a pew a few feet away from where you are now, or talk about being glued to a computer or TV screen that you actually got rid of a year or two ago. In remembering this moment will change. That's just how our brains work. But what won't change is the fact that we have recovered our history, that we once again have our book of lives. In light of everything that has happened since Meyer and all the others lived, that we have recovered their names, their memories, their lives. That is a blessing.